Rejoice, episode 151, Boots and Shoes. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We're into the last couple of pages of Chapter 3, Joyce's Protean, that is to say, ever-changing, portrait of, as it were, the artist, still a young man, Stephen Dedalus, on his Sandymount Strand sojourn. And if James A. Joyce truly meant what he said, and did wish us to spend all our lives reading his work, he sure kicked us off well with these early reaches of Ulysses. As I left you last week, Stephen was lolling and perhaps even languishing. Where's all this alliteration coming from? In the aftermath of what it was called when I went to school, a boy's solitary sin. Interesting subtextual joke going on here, by the way. We were warned, wasn't everyone, that masturbation would make you blind. And here it is in a chapter that's all about seeing and sight and visibility. So here we have the next paragraph. Stephen's leaning back against the sharp rocks, and once again we get a mix of Joyce's third-party narration and Stephen's own interior monologue, his stream of consciousness. Here we go. Here's the quote. His gaze brooded on his broad-toed boots. A buck's cast-offs. Nebenanander. He counted the creases of rucked leather, wherein another's foot had nested warm. The foot that beat the ground in tripudium, foot I dislove. But you were delighted when Esther Oswald's shoe went on you. A girl I knew in Paris. Tiens, quel petit pied! Staunch friend, a brother soul, Wilde's love that dare not speak its name. His arm, Cranley's arm, he now will leave me. And the blame? As I am, all or not at all. End of quotation. Stephen is lying back, and he's looking at the toes of the boots that he's wearing. Note that I didn't say he sees the toes of his boots. Why didn't I? Because they are, as Joyce puts it in Stephen's thought, a buck's cast-offs. They used to be the boots of Stephen's false and mocking friend Buck Mulligan. You'll recognize the next word, because we've already had it in this chapter earlier. Nebeneinander. German word meaning side by side, so Stephen's lying there looking at the broad-toed boots as they are, side by side. The next sentence is perfectly clear. He counted the creases of rucked leather, wherein another's foot had nested warm. Two voices there. Joyce's voice, Stephen's thought. And you begin to reflect for a moment whether Stephen could ever metaphorically put himself in Buck Mulligan's shoes. And when you realize that he couldn't, because the two are such different characters, totally different men, the irony thickens. Sweet literary device this, the cast-off boots. And look at the next sentence for confirmation of that subtle irony. The foot that beat the ground in tripudium, foot I dislove. Stephen's wearing the boots of a man in whose shoes he never wants to stand. And note the neologism, dislove. Or is it a word that Joyce really coined for Ulysses? Is it a neologism? No, it isn't. But you won't find it that often. There were some 16th and 17th century usages of it, not by any prominent writers. And it was just about obsolete by the time Joyce got to it, but at the same time, you have to say it's a kind of obviously useful word, dislove. Not love. Opposite of love. And I haven't skipped over tripudium, in case you're worrying. I've been kind of holding on to it, relishing it, because with one word there, Joyce hits a number of targets, given the different meanings and implications of the word tripudium. A tripudium, or tripudium maybe? No, tripudium we'll call it, is a kind of ritual dance. A ritual dance. Ceremonial dance. And when used in religious ceremonies at Easter and the like, it literally is 3 steps forward and 1 step back. And Stephen here has taken a moral step backwards, at least so he would think, with his guilty Jesuit education now at work on his conscience after masturbating, what the priests would have called self-abuse. A tripudium is also a kind of joyous, stamping dance with a triple beat of the feet. And remember what we've been having in the past few weeks about omens and augurs and auguries and the behavior of birds? A tripudium is a kind of omen, a divination, because when the sacred chickens used by the Roman augurs to divine fate were first fed, and were excited to be fed, they did a kind of chicken dance. And when they did that, the augurs, the soothsayers, were pleased. It foretold good things. The foot that beat the ground in tripudium. Foot I dislove. What a sentence. Next sentence, but you were delighted when Esther Oswald's shoe went on you. Girl I knew in Paris. Tiens, quel petit pied. The French phrase means, gosh, what a little foot. Now, nothing, nothing in this sentence is what it seems. It's almost written in code. Biographically, there's no trace anywhere in Joyce's life of a girl named Esther Oswald. It's the name he gives to a hooker that he met in Paris. And here's why I think so. When Esther Oswald's shoe went on you, well, that's actually a slang term, because there is a slang term for a sexually transmitted disease. Shoes and socks is old rhyming slang. I've got a dose of shoes and socks, meaning I've got a dose of the pox. The choice of the Scandinavian name Oswald confirms it for me. Joyce was a major fan of the Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen, and in Ibsen's play Ghosts, Mrs. Alving's son, the boy who has syphilis, one of the major characters, has the name Oswald. As for the name Esther, well, think of where we've been, on a beach, imagining a woman who might have another life as a hooker at night time in Dublin under the arches. She's trekking westward with the sun, and the word star appears over and over alongside and embedded in references to the sky and the night sky and the stars as augurs and divinations. And the word Esther means star in ancient Hebrew. There's Joyce for you. Next phrase, staunch friend, a brother soul, Wilde's love that dare not speak its name, his arm, Cranley's arm, he now will leave me. Joyce, by the way, added the phrase, a brother soul, in his manuscript draft. It's extra, written above the words. Stephen's meditation at this point is more than interesting. It's a post-coitus homo tristis est moment. After sex, man is sad. And here, Stephen's anxious. And he's reflecting on Wilde and homosexual love. The famous phrase, the love that dare not speak its name, that was created by Lord Alfred Douglas, Oscar Wilde's notorious lover, and a rat, if ever there were one. That was created to discuss homosexual love. Here, though, it raises something that flickers with some power at the end of Joyce's previous novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Stephen, in the novel, had a friend whom Joyce names as Cranley, and here's the description as Stephen sees him. In the shadow of the trees, Stephen saw his pale face, framed by the dark, and his large dark eyes. His face was handsome, his body was strong and hard, and he had spoken of a mother's love. Shortly after, there comes a killing moment when Cranley seems to be offering himself to Stephen as someone, quote, who would be more than a friend, more even than the noblest and truest friend a man ever had. For my money, it's the most intimacy that Stephen Dedalus ever achieves in the works of James Joyce. And all through their conversation, Cranley has taken Stephen's arm, a strong grip, by which Stephen pronounces himself thrilled. And now we have his meditation on that memory. His arm, Cranley's arm. He now will leave me. The Cranley conversation in A Portrait, that took place only a few months before Ulysses, before June 1904, and it's still in Stephen's mind, hence Cranley's arm. But his arm, that refers to the way Buck Mulligan took Stephen's arm earlier in Chapter 1, at the top of the Martello Tower, and how he mocked him, taunted Stephen about Oscar, and in effect raises the taunt that Stephen might himself be of Oscar's persuasion. He said, he told Stephen to his face, you have the real Oxford manner. A euphemism for being gay back then. This is an important moment in the characterization of Stephen. And remember, Oscar Wilde would have been very high in Joyce's student consciousness. In fact, he'd have walked past the house Oscar was born and raised in almost every day of his life at the corner of Merrion Square. Joyce was 18 when Oscar died in 1900, and every male student in Dublin would have known of Oscar's scandals and sexual orientation. And now Stephen considers the termination of his relationship with Mulligan. He now will leave me, and the blame? As I am, all or not at all. Puzzling sentence, right? Yes, absolutely. Number of references here, though. Oscar Wilde, in the picture of Dorian Gray, in that great speech of Dorian's after Sybil Vane has killed herself, the speech in which he says, "Yellow satin could console one for all the miseries of life." I love that. And to become the spectator of one's own life is to escape the suffering of life. I mean, these are great phrases. Oscar begins to show in the story how men draw apart. And that's what Joyce is echoing here between Stephen and Buck Mulligan. When Dorian, in the Stephen role, so to speak, says to Basil Hallward, "You are not stronger. You are too much afraid of life, but you are better. And how happy we used to be together. Don't leave me, Basil, and don't quarrel with me. I am what I am. There is nothing more to be said. I am what I am, all that I am." And the Ibsen reference, that's an echo too, and of so much more. Look at a play of Ibsen's called Brand. It's really not often performed. It's a kind of awkward form, verse form. The last performance I know of was sometime, maybe about 8 or 10 years ago, with Ralph Fiennes in London. And by the way, if you want a great evening's theatre, try and find a good production of Ibsen's Peer Gynt. Marvellous stuff. Sorry, I'm digressing again. Brand, though, it's an early play of his. It's way less accessible. And here's the thing. In Brand, the protagonist is a priestly character. Priestly, not unlike Stephen Dedalus in moral tone. And also like Stephen, he's less than warm to his mother at the point of her death. And he has this all or nothing, Popeye's "I am what I am" position at a crucial moment in the play. Now, you know already that Joyce was a big fan of Ibsen, and we'll come to that. And I believe he truly loved Oscar Wilde and the idea of Oscar Wilde, this brilliant creative genius. But if you're thinking that Stephen Dedalus was entirely based on Joyce, well, think again. And perhaps include, in the model for Stephen, include Ibsen's hero Brand. And by the way, keep an eye here on that mother thing that Brand and Stephen both had in their separate lives. More next week. Join me then. Rejoice, episode 152, Water Music. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. This week, as we near the end of Stephen's Wandering and Resting and Other Things on Sandymount Strand, we get our fullest flavour yet, our first significant herald of something for which Joyce's work became famous and even notorious: his use of sound as language. Onomatopoeia taken by the throat. Onomatopoeia taken beyond its own boundaries. We get just a few lines of it here in this chapter, but it arises again and again in Ulysses. And to my knowledge, he never uses the word onomatopoeia anywhere in the novel. So let me read this next paragraph first, if I can read it in any conventional sense, and then we'll look long and hard at it. Stephen is lying back against the rocks, his hat tilted down on his face, and he's in an anxious and reflective mood, because he has just masturbated in broad daylight, and that will have filled him with guilt, good Catholic boy that he was raised. And now he wants to empty his bladder. But there are people down there on the strand, the gypsy and his wife and their dog, and the stance of a man peeing is unmistakable even from a distance. Here's the text. A lot of Stephen's thoughts here. In long lassos from the Cock Lake the water flowed full, covering green goldenly lagoons of sand, rising, flowing. That's Joyce. Here's Stephen. My ash plant will float away. I shall wait. No, they will pass on, passing, chafing against the low rocks, swirling, passing. Better get this job over quick. Listen. A four-worded wave speech. Vehement breath of waters amid sea snakes, rearing horses, rocks. In cups of rocks it slops, flop, slop, slap, bounded in barrels, and spent, its speech ceases. It flows, purling, widely flowing, floating foam pool, flower unfurling. That's the end of the quote. First of all, perfectly for Joyce, there is or was such a place near where he has Stephen peeing, called Cock Lake. How convenient, Mr. Joyce. North of the Martello Tower, it's a stretch of water, a long sandy mount that pools at high tide, and at low tide would largely be drained dry. I sometimes wonder when I go back and read this chapter for my own delight. Actually, it's all for my delight. I sometimes wonder whether Stephen set up this chapter on Sandymount Strand entirely because of Cock Lake, which, as I say, really has existed. And now you see, Stephen has his penis as a holder of water, a lake within him. So he is a continent with its own sea. And Joyce paints the movements here of the various waters as the tide is coming in. In long lassos from the Cock Lake the water flowed full, covering green goldenly lagoons of sand rising flowing. And Stephen worries that in this incoming tide he will lose his walking stick, his augur's rod. My ash plant will float away, and of course that's full of double meaning. Next, with his bladder nudging him, he thinks, I shall wait. And then in the first half of the next sentence he thinks, no, they will pass on. And he follows this with the word passing, as in passing water. He uses it twice. Passing, chafing against the low rocks, swirling, passing. That's the sea coming in. And then he decides to add moving waters to the moving waters. Better get this job over quick, he says to himself. And he virtually instructs us how to read the next passage. He says, listen. And then if we listen, we hear the symbols that he has put down on the page, as Stephen hears them. Ineluctable modality of the audible, if you like. And here they are again, in what Joyce lassos into what he calls a four-worded wave speech. These are the four words. Seesoo, S-E-E-S-O-O. That's when the water squirts off the bottom of a rock. H-R-S-S. R-S-S-E-E-I-S-S. And oof, O-O-O-S. So it's coming in, it's swirling around, it's going out. The sounds, imagine them like static almost from the old radio sets. But above all, imagine them as the sounds of waves coming in, swirling around rocks. And look what's going on here. Joyce is inviting us to see and hear at the same time. To see and hear at the same time, the very same time. The ineluctable modality of the visible meets the ineluctable modality of the audible. Listen. Vehement breath of waters amid sea snakes, rearing horses, rocks. In cups of rocks it slops, flop, slop, slap, bounded in barrels. Stephen is urinating into the incoming waters that hiss and flow around the rocks. Sea snakes as a pretty obvious double meaning, don't you think? And when he is finished, the voice of his waters quietens. Spent, its speech ceases. Well, there's not a lot of explanation needed in that. Spent, its speech ceases. He can no longer make a noise with the stream he's pouring into the sea. So my advice here is look and listen. Take it in. Hear the sounds of the words inside your head. Breath, sea snakes, rearing horses, rocks. In cups of rocks it slops, flop, slop, slap, bounded in barrels. What was he? Bounded in barrels. What was he drinking last night? And spent its speech ceases. It flows, purling, widely flowing, floating foam pool, flower unfurling. Interesting moment there at the end. Flower unfurling. We'll find that imagery or something very like it later when Mr. Bloom, whom we will be meeting very soon, when he takes a bath. And of course, the word flower is also describing water as something that flows. Not flower as in ow, but as in o, a flower. Water is something that flows, it's a flower. So there we are, a passage of sound, sound of the sea as it's coming towards Stephen, and Stephen's own water sounds inside his head and on the sand as he urinates. Joyce, he was completely aware of what he was doing here. It was all planned and constructed. He was completely open about it. This was a passage he chose to read aloud to friends long before the book was published. And it's an important moment because of all that's going on, all that he's doing here. First of all, and in keeping with everything in Ulysses, he's doing something that literature didn't do in 1922. He's portraying bodily functions, two within the space of a few paragraphs. Secondly, he has Stephen, the would-be poet, being at his most poetic in the use of onomatopoeia. I love that word, by the way. It comes from the Greek word for a name or a word, onom, and peon means to make. And in using the device, Joyce is telling us what he's doing. He's making language. He's doing it so consciously that he even highlights it. Wave speech, he calls it, in a dual meaning, the speech of the waves and the speech that describes waves. So here is Stephen building sound into language and at the same time merging the fluids of his own body with the fluids of the earth, i.e. the same sea that has already been mentioned in chapter 1 as the Great Mother. If there's a moment in Ulysses where Joyce nails his linguistic colors to the mast and says, this is what I'll be doing with, for, to, and by the English language, this is the first stiffened example of techniques with which Joyce managed to frustrate so much of the civilized world. He also manages to keep within the theme of his Protean chapter. The sea is swirling inward, changing everything, as some of Stephen's body is changing, expelling fluid. The land is changing as the sea pours in over it. The language of our lives is changing as Stephen joins his waters to those of the sea and sees them all flowing, purling, floating foam pool. I'll be remembering this passage as we go forward. I bet I'll be referring to it again and again. And I think we're all going to be amazed at how often it will echo, will resonate throughout the book. I feel now as though Stephen, in this last few weeks, I feel as though he has finally begun to tell us who he is. We have, after all, had intimate glimpses of him. And now we'll be able to look at him in the context of his own city of Dublin this sunny Thursday, June the 26th, 1904. More next week. Join me then. Rejoice, episode 153, Weaving Waves. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Stephen on Sandymount Strand has emptied his bladder, his waters, joining forces with the sea. He's a man alone at noon, watching the tide come in and listening to the thoughts in his head and listening to the waves. Here's this week's text. It's beautifully poetic in parts. Under the upswelling tide, he saw the writhing weeds lift languidly and sway reluctant arms, hicing up their petticoats, in whispering water swaying and upturning coy silver fronds. Day by day, night by night, lifted, flooded, and let fall, Lord, they are weary, and whispered too they sigh. St. Ambrose heard it, sigh of leaves and waves, waiting, awaiting the fullness of their times, diebus ac noctibus, in urias patiens ingemisit. To no end gathered, vainly then released, forth-flowing, wending back loom of the moon, weary too in sight of lovers, lascivious men, and naked woman, shining in her courts, she draws a toil of waters. There you are. Well, the first three sentences are straightforward enough, if you can ever use that word about Joyce. The tide waters lifting the weeds by the inner shore. Under the upswelling tide he saw the writhing weeds lift languidly, and the way they raise their branches and fronds, and sway reluctant arms, reminds him of the words of that bawdy song we had in chapter 1, or didn't have because it was so dirty, about Marianne hicing up, that's to say, hiking up her petticoats. With hiking, though, you don't hear the rustle that you hear with hicing. Hicing up their petticoats. In whispering water, swaying and upturning coy silver fronds. Mariana Pot, and it has all to do with urination, naturally, at this juncture. Mariana Pot, the writing along here, is lovely. In whispering water, listen to how it sounds like the waves. In whispering water, swaying and upturning, coy silver fronds. Day by day, night by night, watch that phrase, by the way. Lifted, flooded, and let fall. Lord, they are weary, and whispered too they sigh. You can hear the rhythm of the sea lapping onto a shore in small waves. Stephen is observing the endlessness of the tides and their physical pattern of rising, flooding in across the land, settling and receding, day by day, night by night, lifted, flooded, and let fall. And, as he does here, Joyce often cuts himself loose in Ulysses, producing sentences of great beauty. And sometimes you think he does it just because he can, which I guess is true. What I mean is, apart from sentences with layers of meaning and mine shafts of dense literary reference and literary merit, he was also prepared to write beautiful language in English. And listen to his rhythms. In these passages, his prose does indeed echo the movement of the sea, and he wanted it to. And it echoes something else. Lord, they are weary, and whisper to they sigh. In fact, let's go back for a moment and listen to those two sentences together, because they're not direct quotations from anything major or powerful, and yet they sound as though they are. So what are they? Think of them, here's the clue, think of them as music, the music of the sea, day by day, night by night, whoosh, lifted, flooded, and let fall. Lord, they are weary, and whisper too, they sigh. Now they could be lines from a hymn, could they not? Which is why we then get the reference to St. Ambrose. Ambrosian chant, with which St. Ambrose is credited, feels like the waves of a slow tide, and this introduces something else in Joyce's literary techniques. Well, not totally introduces. We had a touch of it when Mallarmé's name came up some weeks ago, and you may have guessed what I'm talking about. Mimicry. It will arise again and again and again in Ulysses, and we shall have even an entire chapter devoted to the mimicry of other writers in the history of the English language. Now, Ambrosian chant is very particular. I happen to love it, even though it's slower than most. I find it hypnotic, and I just wish I could hear it sung live somewhere. Now, when you do listen to it, and you should, try and apply those two sentences, day by day, night by night, lifted, flooded, and let fall. Lord, they are weary, and whispered to they sigh. Now, immediately, Joyce followed that with St. Ambrose's name. Here's the full sentence. St. Ambrose heard it, sigh of leaves and waves, waiting, awaiting the fullness of their times. Diebus ac noctibus in Urias, patiens ingemissit. Diebus in the days, noctibus in the nights. So, with the Latin tag, Joyce is echoing what he's just written. Inurias, injuries. Patiens or patiens, patient or slow or endure. And here's the key word, always in Latin, the end of the sentence verb in Latin. Ingemissit, from ingemisco, ingemiscere, or less comfortably, ingemo, ingemere, to sigh over, to groan over. And here we go, put it all together. In the days and the nights, it, the sea, groans in endurance, or something like that. There are a couple of ways I could have taken it. And here we learn again, as if there were ever any doubt, the extent, the depth of Joyce's Jesuit education. Ambrose was a 4th century pillar of the church, Archbishop of Milan, and a theological and liturgical commentator. And that sentence comes from his commentary in Romans. In fact, Romans 8, verse 22. Here's the quote: "For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now." How did Joyce know that? Well, he could have got it in school, but the works of St. Ambrose are also in the collection of a former Archbishop of Dublin, and it's now housed in Marsh's Library. So, what have we here then? Well, we have a confluence of thought to influence a confluence of water. That's a good Joyce joke. A confluence of thought, and it shows us, it indicates a confluence of water. And there's something else fascinating about to begin. Stephen is substituting the sea for the original whole creation and observing how the sea endures so much. And here's the next thought that he has. Quote, "To no end gathered, vainly then released, forth-flowing, wending back, loom of the moon." Unquote. What a description of how the sea behaves in its enduring way. And there are two means of understanding the word enduring here: patient and lasting. And now, Stephen draws it in toward himself as he's about to draw the entire chapter to himself. That's the fascinating thing that's about to begin. I'm glancing ahead here, as you can tell. Wonderful description of the tidal effects of the sea. Wonderful loom of the moon. The water being the fabric that's being shuttled back and forth. And that's not all. The moon appears 40 times in Ulysses, and here in this mention, there's an extra depth if you consider the Odyssey. Because how does the Odyssey end? And what is the prevailing theme throughout? Here's a clue. What is Penelope doing, famously, as she waits, hopes, and prays for the return of her missing husband Odysseus from the Trojan Wars? She's weaving at her loom. And every night she undoes what she has woven during the day so that she can tell her predatory suitors that she hasn't finished at her loom. And doesn't the sea weave all the time and never finish? This is just great stuff. Now, where was I? Look, to no end gathered, vainly then released, forth-flowing, wending back, loom of the moon. Yes, and who has ever produced a more original impression of the sea? Next sentence. Weary too in sight of lovers, lascivious men, and naked woman shining in her courts, she draws a toil of waters. Now we have some fun, some linguistic fun. She draws a toil of waters. She is the moon. A toil is a weaving term. It's a net, it's a web. It's the same as toile, the French fabric. Who are the lascivious men? Well, here we think of Artemis, the goddess, also associated with the moon and in weaving. That's in some dimensions of classical mythology. It's not everywhere, but in some parts of classical mythology you will find references to Artemis the weaver. And didn't Artemis turn a man into a stag? We've had this already, because she was lasciviously spying on her. He was lasciviously spying on her. She bathed. By the way, it's worth pointing out here, and I don't think I've said this before. It's worth pointing out here that Joyce repeats himself quite often, deliberately. And there's nothing wrong with that. In most other writers, it would be a mortal sin. But he does it. And here we have Artemis, who did turn a man into a stag, because he was lasciviously spying on her as she bathed. And all this sea of thought, if I may put it like that, all this has come from Stephen watching a gypsy and his wife digging for clams on the beach near the water. He formed a sexual fantasy about the woman's activities at night under the arches of old Dublin, and from it he spun a series of fantastical thoughts about the moon and the stars and the tides. We've had them for the last few weeks, and time after time in Ulysses, we will find that pattern recurring of an incident that ignites a series of thoughts, which are then given added depth by a series of references, which is what has been happening here and happens all through Ulysses. And that's what made Joyce so damn brilliant. More next week. Rejoice, episode 154, The Rattle of Change. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney, and we're rounding the last bend. In the Gabler edition of Ulysses, we're at the bottom of the second last page of chapter 3. 10 paragraphs to go, some of them consisting of only one line. And here's the first of that 10. Stephen's thoughts we're hearing here, internal monologue. He's looking out to sea, remember, he's on Sandymount Strand. Here we go. 5 fathoms out there, full fathom 5 thy father lies. At 1, he said, found drowned. High water at Dublin Bar, driving before it a loose drift of rubble, fan shoals of fishes, silly shells. A corpse rising salt-white from the undertow, bobbing apace, a porpoise, landward. There he is. Hook it, quick, pull. Sunk though he be beneath the watery floor. We have him. Easy now. Well, there you go. We've been expecting this, haven't we? 5 fathoms out there, full fathom 5 thy father lies. At 1, he said, found drowned. We already know about this, if you've been with me through chapter 1. Stephen, now recovering from his pubic exertions of one kind or another, is gazing out to sea, and he's thinking of the depth of water out there. To his head comes the song Shakespeare wrote for Ariel, Prospero's spirit servant, in The Tempest, Act 1, Scene 2. Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change. And not that you need reminding, we are in the chapter that is all about change, and we're by the sea. And remember the 2 men in chapter 1 speculating on when the missing body would show up? Stephen remembers them. At 1, he said. And then, found drowned. Joyce uses just the 2 words. That will be the headline on the tiny newspaper report likely to appear. Man found drowned. Then Stephen considers the tide and what it does. High water at Dublin Bar, driving before it a loose drift of rubble, fan shoals of fishes, silly shells. Keep an eye on those shells. I'll be coming back to them in a week or so. Fan shoals of fishes. Can't you see them, a shoal like a fan? A corpse rising salt-white from the undertow. Well, that's descriptive enough. Bobbing apace, a porpoise landward. Joyce added the words apace, a porpoise at some time after his first pass, because in the manuscript it reads, a corpse rising salt-white from the undertow, bobbing landward. So he added apace, a porpoise. There he is. Hook it quick. Pull. Sunk though he be beneath the watery floor. We have him easy now. That's the end of the paragraph. So what about apace, a porpoise? Well, do you remember Giacomo Joyce? That exquisite poem that Joyce never published in his lifetime, but came out afterward? I mention it because of a description in this chapter of Paris that he used in Giacomo Joyce as a description of Trieste, in Italy, where he lived. Lived in Paris too, of course. Well, there are several cross-references in Giacomo to Ulysses, and many of them are in this chapter, including apace. The phrase comes from an old danling song, danling meaning to dance a child on our knee and sing to it. The lady goes apace, the gentleman trot. And you keep the child bouncing in time to the song. The lady goes apace, the gentleman trot. So he's doing a little dance for the bobbing corpse that's about to be pulled from the sea, and it will be men with a Dublin accent pulling the corpse out of the water. And one of the games Dublin people play is with words, and they would say, the porpoise of this is, or what's the porpoise of that? And it works as a half-image of the sea-whitened corpse, which will look in part like a dead pig, and a porpoise is also called a sea pig in some cultures. Next now, Stephen role-plays in his mind the actions of the men in the boat. They see the body. There he is. They prepare to act. Hook it, quick, pull. Different line now. Sunk though he be beneath the watery floor. A reference. We have him. Easy now. And finally, the job is done. There's only the one query here, I think. Sunk though he be beneath the watery floor. This is a direct quote. And if you're one of the many who've been with me from day 1, you'll recognize this. It was referenced both directly and obliquely in chapter 2, It's from John Milton's poem Lycidas, which remember is about somebody drowning. Stephen was teaching a class and he asked a boy, Talbot, to read from Milton. Here's the quote from Ulysses Chapter 2. A swarthy boy opened a book and propped it nimbly under the breastwork of his satchel. He recited jerks of verse with odd glances at the text. Weep no more, woeful shepherds, weep no more, for Lycidas, your sorrow is not dead, sunk though he be beneath the watery floor. And now, Joyce repeats it here. It's in podcast 58, by the way, if you want to refer backward. So, little summary. There's Stephen, looking out to sea and imagining them holding in the corpse. Fair enough. Here's the next paragraph. This is stronger stuff. Bag of corpse gas, sopping in foul brine. A quiver of minnows, fat of a spongy titbit, flashed through the slits of his buttoned trouser fly. God becomes man, becomes fish, becomes barnacle goose, becomes featherbed mountain. Dead breaths I living breathe, tread dead dust, devour a urinous offal from all dead. Hold stark over the gunwale, he breathes upward the stench of his green grave, his leprous nose-hole snoring to the sun. It's gothic, to say the least. It's zombie-like. And we can make out some of that, can't we? Not that we need to dwell on it. The pictures are vivid enough, right? Bag of corpse gas, sopping in foul brine. A quiver of minnows, fat of a spongy titbit, flashed through the slits of his buttoned trouser fly. It's a graphic, and as I say, gothic description of a body being lifted from the sea that has been in the sea for 9 days. And the same goes for the final sentence that I quoted there. Hold stark over the gunwale, he breathes upward the stench of his green grave, his leprous nose-hole snoring to the sun. Ugh. You certainly see it, and you almost smell it. But what about this sentence there in the middle? God becomes man, becomes fish, becomes barnacle goose, becomes featherbed mountain? Well, we're in a chapter that's all about change. And here we are looking at a seemingly nonsensical list of changes. But as we now know for sure, in Ulysses, never give the name nonsense to what seems like nonsense. So here we go. I'll take each of the 4 phrases in turn. God becomes man, well, that's predictable, especially if, like Stephen Dedalus and James Joyce, you've had a Catholic education. Jesus Christ is a God, and the Son of God become man. So we once again revisit the Trinity, one of the potent themes in Ulysses. Becomes fish. Well, Joyce certainly knew where to go for depth, if you'll forgive the pun. The fish is one of the most potent and ancient symbols in humanity and Christianity, and other things. A fish, the salmon of knowledge, is a great Irish myth. In the circumstances, on the beach, with what Stephen has been doing and fantasizing, and the woman he has been contemplating, I feel entitled to remark that the fish, given its shape, has also long been a symbol of female sexuality because of its genital shape. And there are more applications in many cultures, so Joyce was running on diesel when he brought it in here. He got several depths out of that. And what about fish becomes barnacle goose? And this is fun too. Remember the name of Joyce's lifelong beloved, Nora Barnacle? Yes. And the barnacle goose gets its name from what? Well, this is interesting. There's a Gaelic word that I've heard in the southwest of Ireland, bornoch. It's about the limpet family or other shellfish and crustaceans that cling to rocks. And there are related words all across northern Europe. And there was a folk tradition that from these marine growths came the barnacle goose, because the stems from some of the limpets looked like the stumps of quills. And to round out the legend, it was perfectly possible, said the storytellers, that the barnacle geese were originated like that they didn't get birth by eggs, because nobody saw them all summer. Therefore, they were breeding out of sight under the sea. In fact, they were in breeding grounds in real life, migratory homes up high on the globe near the North Pole. And the phrase, barnacle goose becomes featherbed, well, this is very Joycean. There's a mountain not far from Dublin known as the Featherbed, a great trysting area. Molly Bloom recollects in Ulysses, and so I think does Mr. Bloom. Thinks or talks about the featherbed, but we'll find that out in due course. And goose feathers go into mattresses and pillows. And Joyce and Nora Barnacle probably slept on a featherbed together. And a generation of Irish exiles whose lives were truly changed are called wild geese. Look at all those references from the corpse of a drowned man. Which reminds me, I skipped a sentence. Dead breaths I living breathe, tread dead dust, devour a Uranus offal from all dead. There are certain Joycean sentences, structures, for which I want to come up with a name, and this is one of them. It's kind of chain link. The ideas are separated by commas, yet the whole sentence stands unto itself as a sentence. It's independent of its parts, and it is also the sum of its parts, and yet again it leads us on. As I unpack this, you'll see what I mean. Remember, we're still in Stephen's thoughts. Dead breaths I living breathe, he's thinking. Dead breaths I living breathe, tread dead dust. Earlier, he's been recalling his mother's death, but he's alive. So he's living and breathing. Death is the ultimate change. Remember, man, thou art but dust, and back to dust thou shalt return. That's the Ash Wednesday blessing with which Joyce would have been so familiar at the beginning of Lent. And thought association here for Stephen, his mother's death, and the odour, you may remember, wetted ashes. So it's little flickers all the time, little lights flashing here and there, little connections. It's like a map of a giant railway system, a living electrical map with little bing lights everywhere. As to the phrase, devour a Uranus offal from all dead, this is a little herald to the next chapter, when Leopold Bloom likes to eat kidneys with the faint tang of urine. By the way, I should perhaps here be delving into the word metempsychosis. You'll come across that again, especially with the fish and the barnacle geese, but it arises later in a much more arousing way, so to speak. So I'll keep it until then. Next week, we have the penultimate chunk of Chapter 3. Join me then. Rejoice, episode 155, Lucifer and Lord Byron. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. This is the second last podcast. Have you noticed I'm counting down? On Ulysses Chapter 3, Proteus. And I mean to get through a chunk of it, beginning with this. Now remember where we are, Sandymount Strand, with Stephen Dedalus speculating on the corpse that they will later perhaps be pulling from the sea. Found drowned is Joyce's little headline. Here's our first quotation this week. Stephen's thinking again. A sea change this, brown eyes, salt blue, sea death, mildest of all deaths known to man. Old Father Ocean, Prix de Paris, beware of imitations, just you give it a fair trial. We enjoyed ourselves immensely. End of quote. Yet again, we feel entitled to ask ourselves, what in the name of all that's high and holy is he on about? I should have said before, I know I mentioned it last week in passing, that when it comes to the stream of consciousness techniques in Ulysses, the famed monologue intérieur, you'll find enough word association to enchant a human resources department or a military psychologist. This paragraph is a good example. First sentence, straight enough, the corpse will be pulled from the water and will be physically altered, so Joyce plays with the word sea change, all one word, sea and change put together. What is a sea change anyway? It's used so much. Oh, there's been a sea change in the financial markets, or there's been a sea change in political thinking. Well, it does indeed come from Shakespeare, from Ariel's song in The Tempest, which I quoted here a few weeks ago. Here's the crucial line again, maybe it was last week. Here's the crucial line again in the verse that begins, full fathom 5, thy father lies. Here's the crucial line, nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change. In other words, it's a full transformation. That's what a sea change is, as would indeed happen to a body that's been in the water for 9 days. Simple as that. Shakespeare coined it. The man's brown eyes would have turned blue with sea salt. Shakespeare took it further and said they'd be pearls by now. Next sentence. Sea death, mildest of all deaths known to man. Where does that old folk belief come from? That old folk belief that said drowning is the most peaceful way to die. And anyway, how do they know? Who's come back and said, oh yeah, drowning was nice. I loved it. Yeah, it was great, dead easy. I think we're back in Homer again. And wouldn't it be wonderful if that belief that I heard the people of the Irish countryside saying in my childhood, wouldn't it be wonderful if that belief descended to them from the Odyssey? Because Odysseus is told by the ghost of the blind prophet from Thebes, Tiresias. Here's the quote from the Odyssey: "Death shall come to you from the sea, and your life shall ebb away very gently when you're full of years and peace of mind." Incidentally, if you do want to spend some time, and I've banged on about this before, if you do want to spend some time with the Odyssey, look out for Samuel Butler's translation, which is good and lively. In chapter 11, where that quote comes from, that's a cracker. Tiresias is only one of its stars. Now, let me look again. Next sentence. That's just 3 words. Old Father Ocean. Well, that's Neptune, or Proteus. It's another name for the sea. Next. Prix de Paris. Beware of imitations. Just you give it a fair trial. This makes me laugh out loud. Mr. Bloom is on the way. The advertising salesman is drawing near. We shall meet him shortly. Beware of imitations. Just you give it a fair trial. That's the ad man speaking. But, Prix de Paris, there's also Ajax. There were several events and entities called Prix de Paris: fashions, trade, fine art, I think. But one of them was a horse race. And listen to this. That horse race was won in 1904, the year of Ulysses, by a horse called Ajax. Ajax. And who, in classical mythology, was Ajax? He was the warrior who, in the Trojan War, stood shoulder to shoulder with Odysseus, whom the Romans called Ulysses, or Ulysses, or Ulysses. And if Joyce had only lived another 6 years, he'd have seen in 1947 the arrival on the market of a cleaning powder called Ajax. He will do anything for a reference. What about these 3 sentences? Beware of imitations. Just you give it a fair trial. We enjoyed ourselves immensely. Well, visualize what's going on. What's Stephen doing? He's recovering a little from his exertions and gazing out to sea. And he sees the gypsy couple and he thanks them, ironically, of course, in his mind. And it's quite a good joke, actually, when you think of what Stephen was doing because of them. We enjoyed ourselves immensely. Now, I'm working backwards here. So that's it. That's those 3. Adman slogans and Stephen looking at the couple. And now also, look at, stop putting together all the other connections. Do you remember way back early in the chapter, sometime last year, one of his most powerful thoughts had to do with the white horses on the sea, the caps of the waves, the advancing waves. He called them the steeds of the old 3-legged god Manannán mac Lir, the steeds of Manannán. And so here he is now, thinking of a horse race in Paris, and the horses, the white horses on the sea, and therefore a Trojan horse in Troy. And what was the cause of all that? Paris and Helen. Helen of Troy was the face that launched 1,000 ships. Or was the Prix de Paris, the prize of Paris, because that was Paris's prize. He stole her from Menelaus, the king of Sparta, and caused the Trojan War. Just caused it by abducting Menelaus's wife Helen. And what happened in the Trojan War? Ajax and Odysseus fought side by side. As I said, we're back in Homer. Only, there's a suggestion that the gods arranged it. So Paris only got a fake Helen, a ghost Helen. Hence, accept no imitations. The real Helen was in Egypt, being protected by none other than King Proteus. And this chapter is called Proteus. See how it all pulls in together? It's just great. By the way, you can also throw Aphrodite in here for good measure, and she emerged from the sea in Cyprus. I've been to the very spot, Aphrodite's birthplace. And because Paris thought her the fairest of them all, she gave him Helen as a prize. So think of Stephen's thoughts as an ancient Greek reality show. Look at all the little jingles and jangles he's got going on there in his mind. It's as good a portrait of how the human mind works, the literary human mind works, as anything I've ever come across. Great stuff. Next paragraph. Quote, Stephen's thinking again. Come, I thirst. Clouding over. No black clouds anywhere, are there? Thunderstorm. All bright he falls, proud lightning of the intellect. Lucifer, dico quinescit occasim. No. My cockle hat and staff, and his my sandal shoon, where to evening lands evening will find itself. This is actually, as the end of the quotation, this is actually easier than it looks. Stephen is getting ready to move on. He may not be feeling that wonderful about himself and his little carnal bout of fantasy and his bad thoughts and bad deeds making himself go blind. We haven't thought about that one, have we? In fact, his eyesight is so bad, and we know why, don't we? He looks for black clouds, and he thinks of Christ on the cross saying, I thirst. Gospel according to St. John, the only eyewitness of the crucifixion. Here's the line. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things are now finished, that the scripture might be accomplished, saith, I thirst. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in two from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks were rent. According to Mark, and when the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. Luke 2, and a darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour, the sun's light failing. See, some things you never forget. So Stephen, good Catholic boy, as he was raised, checks the sky for a thunderstorm, as though God will send down bolts of lightning on him for his carnal sin. When Christ died, the heavens went black, rent asunder. And there he is, thinking, clouding over, no black clouds anywhere, are there? A thunderstorm. No small ego, by the way, to think that he might be singled out for punishment. Those are his thoughts. Now look what comes next. And again, there's a real power underlying this. All bright he falls, proud lightning of the intellect. Remember, Stephen has fallen short of his own standards, or at least the Jesuit standards. The Jesuit definition of sin to schoolboys I knew in Ireland, contemporaries of mine, was sin is falling short of your own standards, falling being the operative word. All bright he falls, proud lightning of the intellect. Who was all bright and who fell because he was so proud of his own brilliance? Here it comes in the next line. Lucifer, dico quinescit occasim. Lucifer, the most wonderful of the angels, the light carrier, the finest angel of them all, fell from grace because he was full of pride and thought himself as good as God. Now this gets really interesting. Occasim, in that Latin tag, is the objective case of occasus or ocasus. Different schools have different pronunciations. And it means really the setting of heavenly bodies, from which comes our English language word Occident. Occident meaning the West. And we've already been looking westward, as Stephen imagined the gypsy woman trekking towards the evening star. The literal translation of that Latin phrase, Lucifer dico quinescit occasim, is therefore, Lucifer, I say, who knows no setting in the sky, who has no place in heaven. Nescio nescere is not to know. Lucifer, who's now in hell. That's why he has no place in the heavens. Stephen will have heard a similar phrase in the Easter ceremonies of the Catholic Church. And now, that's why it's in his mind. The next sentence completes a kind of extraordinary cluster. My cockle hat and staff, and his my sandal shoon. There's a word there that you can't read at first. It looks like hismy, H-I-S-M-Y, but it's his and my. All one word. He has rolled his and my, the two pronouns, into one word, because he's wearing shoes that are mulligans. His shoes are now my shoes, thinks Stephen. The cockle hat and staff, we've had that before. Here's the pilgrim setting out. Pilgrims make their pilgrimages often to atone. And it's also, remember, his Hamlet hat. So we've got, in this order, in that bunch of prose. We've got Christ and Satan, Lucifer, Hamlet, and Buck Mulligan, and Lord Byron, George Gordon Lord Byron, who, in his famous Childe Harold poem, had these lines: "A single recollection not in vain. He wore his sandal shoon and scallop shell. Farewell, with him alone may rest the pain. And there's no doubt in my mind when I see that Joyce did have Byron's Childe Harold in mind, because, like Stephen, Harold was a sometimes somewhat miserable young man, depressed and melancholy and moral. And Stephen, still romanticizing him to some degree, sees himself as going west. He's actually going north into Dublin City, because Ocasum had made him think west, where the evening star will be, where the sun sets. And here comes a beauty of a reference. Here comes an absolute beaut. Do you remember some weeks ago I mentioned a lyric play, quite a difficult lyric play, by Byron's great contemporary Percy Shelley? No stranger to Dublin, by the way. Shelley's play was called Hellas, the old name for Greece. And that's where the Evening Lands line came from. But so does this line. A new Ulysses leaves once more Calypso for his native shore. And in Ulysses, the next chapter, chapter 4, which we'll be on to the week after next, could have been called, in Joyce's scheme of things, he said it should be called Calypso. And next week, we have the final few paragraphs of chapter 2, and my jaw can take a rest. Join me then.